Three Native American sisters vanished in 1945 from an Indian boarding school in the United States. Their disappearance went unnoticed by most during this chaotic time. But one person, their biological older brother, never gave up the search after
40 years, he makes a shocking discovery. A disturbing find that would change everything and expose the dark truth of what was really happening during that era in American history. The desert wind swept dust and regret through Whispering Rock, New Mexico. As Thomas Red Elk, 58, sat beside his rusted 1971 camper, it was 1985, and after 4 decades of searching, he had stopped here tired, broken and clinging to memories. Thomas, though his birth name was Ashkiyaji, and the boarding school had christened him, Tommy spread the yellowed newspaper across his lap with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. 40 years old this paper was, but he treated it like it was printed yesterday. The headline read, "Indian Boarding Schools Forging America's Bright Future," and below it a photograph that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. 3 young girls sat on the wooden porch steps of a small chapel, their dark hair braided neatly, their white cotton dresses pressed and clean for the cameras behind them slightly. Out of focus but unmistakably present stood a priest in black robes holding a Bible. Thomas knew every detail of that photograph. The way Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, how Naomi's left shoulder tilted slightly from an old injury, the serious expression on little Eva's face that made her look older than her 8 years. Those weren't their real names. Of course, the boarding school had stripped those away along with everything else. Sarah had been born Nazi, meaning she flows around in their grandmothers. Choice because the child had been born during the spring floods. Naomi was Elise. She is Precious and Ava was Aylin Joy. They had been his baby sisters torn from their family in Cottonwood Bluffs when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came with their papers, and their promises and their lies. Thomas took a long pull from his beer, letting the bitter liquid wash down, the even more bitter memories. He had been 14 when they came for the 4 children, using their father's arrest as justification. Their father had resisted when government officials tried to seize their ancestral lands, and their mother had died giving birth to Alan, leaving the children vulnerable to the federal assimilation policy that swept through Indian country like a plague wards of the state they'd called them, as if being made orphans was some kind of gift. St. Gertrude Indian Boarding School had been their prison for years. The boys and girls were kept strictly separated, which meant Thomas rarely saw his sisters except during the mandatory morning mass and evening devotions. Even then, speaking to them in Da was forbidden, punishable by days locked in the basement, or worse, the beatings that left marks hidden beneath their uniforms. But the worst day, the day that still woke him in cold sweats, had been in 1945 when he was 18. World War II was ending, but the discrimination against indigenous people remained as sharp as ever. The school had been preparing for weeks for what they called a press visit. Thomas remembered how they had lined up the children like products in a store window. The youngest ones placed prominently because their wide eyes and frightened expressions photographed. Well, his sisters had been chosen specifically for the photo session because of what the priest called their innocent beauty and their obvious fear, which the newspapers would interpret as reverence. The reporters had come with their bulky cameras and notepads, asking scripted questions about gratitude and salvation, while the priests nodded approvingly. They had taken dozens of photographs, including the one now spread across Thomas's lap. The next day his sisters were gone. He had realized at first during morning mass, when their usual spots in the girl section remained empty. When evening devotion came and they still hadn't appeared, panic had set in. He had approached the guardians asking desperately about his sisters, but they had refused to answer. Instead, they had beaten him for his insolence, locked him in the basement for 3 days, and told him to forget he'd ever had sisters at all. But Thomas couldn't forget. When the beatings intensified and still no information came, he had made his escape. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's half-hearted search efforts lasted only a few days. There had been no missing child flyers, no real police investigation, just the quiet understanding that one more Indian boy had disappeared into the vast American landscape, and no one in authority particularly cared for 40 years. He had wandered the Southwest in his camper, following whispers and rumors, showing that newspaper photograph to anyone who would look. He had survived on odd jobs, construction work when his back could handle it, small repairs for cash occasional, handouts from veteran shelters despite never having served in the military. Whispering Rock had been his home for the last decade, not because he'd found any trace of his sisters, but because he'd finally given up. The town was dying just like he was, and it seemed like an appropriate place to wait for the end. The beer bottle made a hollow sound as the last drops disappeared down his throat. Thomas cursed under his breath, folding the newspaper carefully and placing it back in the passenger seat, where it lived. His hands were steadier when he had something to drink, steadier when the memories weren't quite so sharp around the edges. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, listening to the engine cough to life like an old man clearing his throat. The liquor store was only 10 minutes away, the only liquor store in this tired little town, and Marta would be working behind the counter like she always was. The bell above the door chimed as Tommy entered, and Marta Dane looked up from behind the counter with a smile that held genuine warmth. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and kind eyes that had seen enough of life to understand suffering without judgment. "Tommy," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Let me guess the beer ran out again." He managed a weak smile in return. Marta was one of the few people in Whispering Rock who treated him like a human being rather than just another drunk Indian to be avoided. Their friendship had developed slowly over the past few years, built on small conversations and mutual respect. "You know me too well, Marta," Tommy replied, making his way to the cooler in the back of the store. He selected 6 bottles of the cheapest beer available and carried them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, Tommy's heart sank. The crumpled bills in his pocket amounted to less than half of what he needed. He had forgotten about the money he had spent on gas the previous week, and his next disability check wasn't due for another 5 days. Marta watched him count and recount the bills, her expression growing concerned. "Tommy," she said gently, "you look sick and tired. When was the last time you had a real meal?" Tommy shrugged, embarrassed by his obvious poverty and the way alcohol had become the center of his existence. "Money's tight right now. I'll come back when my check arrives." But Marta leaned forward, her hands clasped on the counter. "I know this isn't easy for you, what you're dealing with. I've seen the newspaper you carry, seen the pain in your eyes. Maybe you could come to church with me this Sunday. You look like you could use it." Tommy's first instinct was to refuse. He had learned Catholic teachings at the boarding school, memorized countless prayers and biblical passages, but he had never found comfort in religion. If anything, Christianity reminded him of everything that had been taken from him, he had also long ago abandoned his traditional Navajo spirituality, feeling disconnected from both worlds. Church isn't a place for someone like me, Marta, he said quietly. I'm not religious, and I don't think your God would want me there. But Marta's eyes sparkled with determination. Tell you what, if you come to church with me and stay for the entire service, I'll buy you these 6 bottles of beer, and if you're still not convinced that it helped, I'll throw in 2 extra bottles. Tommy looked at her skeptically. You're trying to bribe me with alcohol to go to church, isn't that against Catholic rules or something? Marta laughed. A sound like silver bells. Maybe it is. But sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes people need practical incentives to open their hearts to possibilities they hadn't considered. The offer was tempting more than tempting. 8 bottles of beer for sitting through one church service seemed like a reasonable trade, especially since he had nothing else to do with his Sunday. And Marta's sincerity was hard to ignore. Okay, Tommy said finally. But I want to be clear, I'm doing this for the beer, not for salvation. Marta's smile widened. That's honest, at least. The service starts in 30 minutes at Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. It's not far from here. Just follow the main road toward the mountains and turn left at the big wooden cross. Can you manage to stay? Sober for 30 minutes, Tommy considered asking for just 1 beer now to steady his nerves. But something in Marta's expression made him reconsider. Okay, I'll meet you there. Back in his camper, Tommy searched through his few possessions for something appropriate to wear to church. His cleanest t-shirt was still stained and worn, but it would have to do. He splashed water on his face from a plastic jug, combed his graying hair with his fingers, and tried to make himself presentable. As he drove toward Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish, Tommy wondered what he was getting himself into. The church was a modest building with adobe walls and a simple wooden cross mounted above the entrance. Several cars were parked in the gravel lot, and he could see people in their Sunday clothes walking toward the main doors. Tommy parked his battered camper next to a pristine sedan and immediately felt self-conscious about the contrast. But Marta appeared at his elbow as soon as he stepped out, her face bright with, "Welcome. Thank you for coming, Tommy," she said, linking her arm through his. "I think this might be exactly what you need." Inside Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish, the afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across wooden pews that had seen decades of worship and prayer. The church was modest, but well-maintained, with whitewashed adobe walls and a simple wooden altar adorned with fresh desert flowers. Tommy followed Marta to a pew near the back, conscious of his worn clothing and the faint smell of beer that probably clung to him, despite his attempts to clean up. He slumped into the hard wooden seat, arms crossed, waiting impatiently for the service to end so he could claim his promised beer. When the congregation stood for the opening hymn, Tommy reluctantly rose to his feet, mumbling along to words he half remembered from his boarding school days. When they sat, he sat. When they knelt, he remained seated, drawing a few disapproving glances that he ignored. The priest who approached the altar was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. "That's Father Murphy," Marta whispered. "He's been here for 15 years. Goodman." Tommy nodded absently, but then something caught his attention. To the other side of the room, just below the altar, stood a group of nuns that seemed somehow different from what he expected. He pointed them out to Marta, who followed his gaze with interest. "Usually the nuns aren't there," she whispered back. "And they're wearing different-colored habits, longer ones, too different from the nuns from this church. Seems like there's something special happening today." The nuns wore black robes that reached to the floor, their faces partially obscured by their head coverings. There was something austere about their presence, a severity that reminded Tommy uncomfortably of the boarding school. But there was also something else. Most of them appeared to be indigenous women, their features familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Father Murphy's sermon washed over Tommy like background noise. He caught fragments about faith and perseverance, about God's plan revealing itself in unexpected ways, but his attention kept drifting to the nuns standing silently at the side of the altar. There was something about their stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as if they were statues, rather than living women. When the service was nearly concluded, Father Murphy made an announcement that snapped Tommy back to attention. "Before we dismiss today, I want to let everyone know about a special opportunity. The sisters from the Handmaid. Sisters of St. Dinah are visiting our church as part of their annual tour of Catholic churches throughout New Mexico. They're here to offer healing revival prayers, and everyone who feels the need for prayer is invited to receive it." Marta nudged Tommy gently. "You should approach the sisters," she said. "It would be good for you." Tommy shook his head. "Let's go back. I fulfilled my side of the promise." "Well then, let's go back to the store." Marta agreed. But as they began to move toward the exit, Father Murphy approached them. He recognized Marta and smiled warmly. "Marta, how good to see you, and who did you bring with you today?" Marta introduced Tommy, and the priest extended his hand with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful to have you here. Thomas, I don't think I've seen you at our services before." Tommy found himself responding, despite his intentions to remain aloof. "It's been a while since I went to church. Used to do it when I was at a boarding school. I almost forgot all those Bible teachings. But what you said today gave me some inspiration." Something in Tommy's manner encouraged Father Murphy to continue the conversation. Perhaps it was the paint that lived behind his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly, but the priest seemed to recognize a soul in need of healing. As they talked, Tommy found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He confessed his struggles with alcohol, his battles with pain that never seemed to end, though he carefully avoided mentioning his missing sisters. That wound was too deep, too personal to share with a stranger, no matter how kind. When Tommy finished, the priest spoke quietly about the visiting nuns. "The sisters from the Handmaid, Sisters of St. Dinah, live very solemn lives," he explained. "They're devoted entirely to prayer and Catholic teaching. They've taken vows of silence and celibacy, and they don't interact with the public except during their healing month and this annual event when they visit churches throughout New Mexico." He gestured toward the Black Road figures. "You don't even have to speak to them. Just write your prayer request on one of the forms, light a candle, and put your request in the box where they stand. They'll pray for those requests when they return to their monastery. Then, in a few weeks, they'll write replies on the back of the prayer forms to deliver God's message. The church will return those papers to you." Tommy considered this intrigue, despite himself. So the nuns will write exactly what God tells them for each individual prayer request. "That's right," Father Murphy confirmed. Marta encouraged him again, and Tommy found his curiosity piqued. He had never heard of anything quite like this before. Maybe he could ask God about his sisters, about where they might be. It seemed worth trying, especially since it required no real commitment on his part. So he walked to the front of the church, his footsteps echoing slightly on the tile floor. At a small table he found prayer forms and a pen. His handwriting was shaky as he wrote his name, and his request the words coming from a place of desperation he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Guided by one of the silent sisters, he lit a candle, the flame dancing in the still air of the church. He awkwardly crossed himself, the gesture feeling Foreign after so many years away from formal religion, then approached the box where the 5 nuns stood guard. Up close, he could see that most of the nuns did indeed have indigenous features, and the sight filled him with conflicted emotions. It reminded him too vividly of the boarding school, of the way indigenous children had been forced to participate in their own cultural destruction. But there was also something else, a familiarity that he couldn't quite place. The prayer box was nearly full, and Tommy had to press his folded form down firmly to fit it inside. As he did so, he looked up at the nun standing closest to the box and felt compelled to speak. "If you're right about this," he said quietly, "if your God is stronger than our traditional spirits, then he should be able to tell me where my 3 missing sisters are. If he does, I'll be a devoted Catholic for the rest of my life." Tommy smiled slightly, hoping to connect with these women who shared his heritage, but none of the nuns smiled back. However, he noticed their expressions shift subtly when he mentioned his missing sisters. There was something in their eyes, perhaps, a level of empathy, but he couldn't interpret. As he turned to walk back to Marta and Father Murphy, Tommy glanced over his shoulder one last time. He watched as the nun who had caught his attention lifted the heavy prayer box to carry it to a side room. She limped noticeably as she walked, favoring her right leg, and nearly stumbled under the box's weight. When she reached the door and pulled it open, a gust of wind from outside caught her habit, causing it to flutter against her face. For just a moment, Tommy caught a clear glimpse of her left temple, and his heart nearly stopped. There, partially hidden by her habit, was a thick raised scar running along her left sideburn. The sight hit Tommy like a physical blow. Naomi had borne a scar in the same place a moment from the day she had tried to protect little Eva from a particularly cruel nun wielding a wooden ruler. Tommy had learned about the incident weeks later, when Naomi had whispered the story to him after morning mass, her voice shaking with remembered pain and fear. Tommy started to call out, his mouth opening to form his sister's name, but the door closed with a soft click before he could make a sound. The moment passed, leaving him standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Another sister approached him and gestured silently for him to move, along pointing to the small line of people that had formed behind him. Tommy mumbled an apology and forced his feet to carry him back to where Marta and Father Murphy waited, his mind reeling with the impossible possibility that he'd just seen his long-lost sister Tommy walked back to where Marta and Father Murphy stood near the altar, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I saw one of the nuns limping, and it caught my attention, reminded me of something from the past." Father Murphy's expression grew concerned. "Are you all right? You look pale." Tommy took a deep breath, realizing that the moment had arrived to share what he had kept buried for so long. "Father, I need to tell you something. I had 3 sisters, and they've been missing for 40 years. They were taken from our boarding school, St. Gertrude Indian Boarding School, in Cottonwood Bluffs." The priest's eyes widened with sympathy. "Taken, what happened?" "It was 1945. Tommy continued, the words coming easier now. "That he had started. There was a press visit. Reporters taking pictures of the school to show how well the assimilation program was working. After that day, my sisters just vanished. The school officials wouldn't tell me anything. When I kept asking questions, they beat me and locked me up." He paused, gathering strength. "I checked on the boarding school years later. It's abandoned now, falling apart, but the pain of losing them, it's never left me." Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. We came from an indigenous Navajo family. First, we were separated from our father when they arrested him for resisting land seizure. Then I was separated from my sisters. I've been searching for them ever since, but I've never found any trace of where they went. Father Murphy placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. I cannot imagine the anguish you've carried all these years. What guidance are you seeking? How do I forgive? Tommy asked, his voice cracking. How do I move on from all of this? The anger, the loss I drink to forget, but it never really goes away. Father Murphy was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Have you ever heard of Abraham from the Bible? He asked finally. He waited. Decades for God to fulfill his promise of a son. Abraham had to learn patience and faith, even when everything seemed hopeless. Sometimes God's timing is not our timing, but his answers do come. The priest gestured toward the front of the church, where Tommy had just submitted his prayer request. I truly believe you should wait for God's answer to the prayer you just made. Many members of my congregation have received responses from the Handmaid Sisters, and they found them to be remarkably accurate and meaningful. Perhaps this is how God will finally speak to you about your sisters. Tommy felt a spark of hope. But this mind was also full of questions. Father, can you tell me more about these nuns, the Handmaid Sisters of Sdina, who founded their order, and why do most of them appear to be indigenous women? Father Murphy's demeanor shifted noticeably. The founder was Father Milford. He passed away many years ago. His son, Father Milford II, continues the ministry now. We are not allowed to talk about this. They are a sacred missions. But why are most of the nuns indigenous? Tommy pressed. And where is their monastery? I'd like to visit them to understand their work better. The priest shook his head firmly. I can't provide information about their monastery location. The Handmaid Sisters are a very private and reclusive Catholic mission group. They operate what they call a sanctuary for women in prayer and penance. They've taken strict vows of silence and practice extreme modesty. No contact. No visitors. They're completely cut off from the outside world except for these annual church visits. Tommy sensed there was more that Father Murphy wasn't telling him, but the priest's body language made it clear the conversation was over. Marta stepped forward, breaking the awkward silence. Well, Tommy, I think it's time I fulfill my side of our bargain, she said with a smile. They excused themselves from Father Murphy and walked back to the parking lot. The afternoon heat shimmered off the gravel as they reached their vehicles. I'll meet you back at the store, Marta said, climbing into her car. Tommy drove his camper through the dusty streets of Whispering Rock, his mind churning with everything that had happened. At the liquor store, Marta kept her promise, handing him 8 bottles of beer with a gentle admonition. Try not to finish all 8 in one day, she said kindly, and maybe we can go to church again next week. Tommy nodded absently, his thoughts still on the limping nun and her distinctive scar back at his camper. He noticed a piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. He pulled it free and saw it was a flyer announcing the Handmaid Sisters of St. DNA annual church tour with a schedule of upcoming visits to various churches throughout New Mexico over the coming weeks. Tommy folded the flyer without reading it thoroughly and opened one of his beers. As he started the camper's engine and took a long swig, he drove past Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. One more time. This time he saw the 5 nuns emerging from the church and climbing into a plain white van. A young church volunteer carried several boxes, presumably containing the prayer requests, and loaded them into the van's rear compartment. Curiosity, overwhelmed Tommy's original plan to return to his usual parking spot. He pulled out the flyer again, hoping to find an address for the monastery, but there was nothing other than instructions to visit the churches on their tour schedule to submit prayers. Since Father Murphy had refused to provide the monastery's location, Tommy decided to follow the van and see where these mysterious nuns actually lived. His curiosity was fueled partly by the hope of uncovering more about the limping nun, but more deeply by a need to understand why so many indigenous women had joined this secluded Catholic order. Maybe someone there had seen his sisters, or maybe they had even become part of it. He only hoped that those women had found a better life than the one he remembered from the boarding school. It was about 1 in the afternoon when Tommy began following the van out of Whispering Rock. He stayed well back, keeping several car lengths between them to avoid detection. The van headed east, toward the mountains, and as they drove further from town, the landscape became increasingly desolate. Scrub brush and yellow grasses stretched toward distant peaks, broken only by the occasional weathered fence post or abandoned homestead. After nearly an hour of driving through this remote terrain, Tommy spotted something unexpected in the distance. A large compound surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with what appeared to be prayer flags rather than barbed wire. A sturdy gate blocked the entrance, and beside it stood a small guardhouse. Tommy pulled off the road and parked behind a cluster of desert brush, watching as the white van approached. The gate, a young Native American man emerged from the guardhouse, stoic and alert, scanning the area suspiciously before opening the gate to allow the van inside. From his concealed position, Tommy studied the compound. This was nothing like the peaceful monastery he had imagined. The buildings looked worn and utilitarian, more like a prison or detention facility than a place of spiritual contemplation. The presence of fencing and an armed guard only reinforced this impression. As the gate closed behind Theven, Tommy remained hidden among the brush, his beer growing warm in his handas. He tried to process what he was seeing. Tommy remained parked behind the desert brush for nearly half an hour, watching the compound for any signs of activity and contemplating whether he should approach the watchman at the gate. The afternoon sun beat down on his camper's metal roof, but outside nothing moved behind the chain-link fence except the occasional flutter of the prayer flags in the hot wind. While he waited, Tommy reached into a small cabinet beside his makeshift bed and pulled out an old wooden cigar box that had traveled with him for 4 decades. The box was worn smooth from handling its corners, rounded, and its finish faded to a dull brown. Inside were the few precious items he had managed to salvage from his old life, the fragments of identity that the boarding school hadn't been able to destroy. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The first item was a collection of brittle school photographs, their edges cracked and yellowed with age. Most showed groups of children, in identical uniforms, their faces solemn and distant. But there was one photo he treasured above all others, a candid shot of his 3 sisters sitting together on the dormitory steps, taken by a sympathetic kitchen worker who had given it to him, in secret. Beneath the photographs lay his most precious possession, a piece of turquoise set in silver, suspended from a leather cord that had grown soft and dark with wear. Tommy lifted the pendant, carefully feeling its familiar weight in his palm. His father had made 4 identical pendants, one for each of his children during the winter before they were taken away. The turquoise was a deep robin's egg blue with veins of darker stone running through it like ancient rivers. Tommy turned the pendant over and traced the engraved Navajo symbols on the back with his fingertip, Ashki Yaji. He whispered his real name etched in the traditional script that connected him to generations of ancestors. His father had told him the pendant would protect him and help him remember who he truly was, no matter how far he traveled from home. The last item in the box was a folded piece of paper that looked like trash but held immeasurable value to Tommy. It was an old lunch menu from the boarding school, kitchen printed on cheap paper that had somehow survived 40 years of careful handling. But it wasn't the menu itself that mattered. It was what Tommy had drawn on the back during one of many sleepless nights in the dormitory. The pencil sketch was faded, but still clear, his three sisters, in a moment of rare tenderness, with Naomi gently braiding Eva's long hair, while Sarah sat nearby, her mouth open in song. Tommy had been gifted at drawing and sketching, had been his only escape from the harsh realities of boarding school life. He had created this image from memory, after an evening when he had glimpsed his sisters together during chapel, and it captured a moment of love and sisterhood that the school's rigid discipline couldn't completely suppress. Now, comparing the sketch to his memory of the limping nun at the church, Tommy felt his heart race. The eyes were the same shape, the mouth had the same gentle curve, and most telling of all was the distinctive scar on the left temple Naomi had gotten that scar defending little Eva from a particularly cruel nun who had been beating her with a wooden ruler. The wound had healed badly, leaving a thick raised mark that no amount of time could erase. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of the compound gate opening. Tommy looked up to see a smaller car, a modest sedan, driving out of the